of Africa, which is known as a classically bad neighborhood for conflict issues. It's quite unstable. The countries surrounding Ethiopia have some measure of conflict and instability. So that's sort of the regional setting. In terms of the national setting, Ethiopia is a party state. It's one party rule. There is some contention within society itself, questioning that rule, which is constant, although a lot of it is more implicit than explicit in terms of how it's expressed. All of the seats in parliament are held by one ruling party. So that's the national level. At the state or regional level, we want to look at Oromia. If you look at the slide, you'll see in yellow is Oromia National Regional State. That is a state that is distinctive ethnically. It's the largest ethnicity in the country. However, disproportionately, there's not much political power coming out of Oromia. And so there are continual protests for more autonomy for that state. The language is different there. It's Afan Oromo. It's not Amharic, which is sort of the national recognized language of Ethiopia. And then if you look more closely at the local level, we go to Borno State, which is at the bottom of the yellow of Oromia on the border with Kenya. That's where the project is located. And in recent years, there's been lots of conflict there. In this map, you can see in the left inset, Oromia is in yellow at the bottom, and in Borno zone, rather. So this is Borno zone that's shown in this particular map. And in green, you see the local communities where the project took place. Okay, so that's 12 different communities in 3 different districts. To give you a scale, that's kind of maybe 400 kilometers from east to west. What is it like there? So these are semi-arid rangelands. They have their long range or planting season rains from March to May. Short season rains between September and November. It's ethnically diverse. So you have a predominant group, the Borana, but others as well, the Guji, the Gabra. These are pastoralist and agro-pastoralist groups. And adjacent, there are some agricultural groups, the Kanso and the Burji. The Borana, however, are the dominant group. And they have very strong customary or traditional institutions known as Gada institutions. Okay? Gada institutions rule political life, social life, religious life within the community, and there is a leader, and the leader is called Abba Gada, and he is elected for 8-year periods. So this is a very culturally coherent group within the project area, but there are other ethnicities. And there's some bones of contention between Borana's dominance and the other groups. Violence has characterized this area for some time, especially, let's say, 2005, 2014, 2015, and there's a problem of escalation and revenge. So there's one killing, and then 4 people are killed in revenge, and then hundreds of cattle are taken in retaliation for that. And then in this one case that we were told about, ultimately, the houses of 2 people in entire communities were burnt down. So it's this cycle of revenge, retaliation, and escalation that has really caused a lot of problems here for quite some time. I'll go pretty quickly through the climate trends slides here. I just want to sort of lay the baseline of what's happening there in terms of climate. Here, if you look at this particular chart, it's the 2 most recent decades. Take a look at the orange line on the top. And what it's showing you is that in the past decade, temperatures were warmer than they were before in 11 out of 12 months. If you look to the future, Here's a chart, which it's 11 different climate models saying what's going to happen in this region between now and the end of the century compared to the last 50 or 60 years. They're unanimous. They all say the same thing. Okay, temperatures are going up, clustering kind of around 1.5 degrees Celsius. What does this mean as sort of a lived experience for the people who are there? Within this Gada tradition that I referred to, the general understanding is that severe droughts happen kind of, once or twice each 8-year Gada period. That's typical. So that's the left-hand column, which I've X'd out just sort of illustratively. This is what they might have expected, okay? But on the right-hand side is the column of actual observed weather data, what actually has happened in the 21st century in this area of southern Ethiopia. And what you see, of course, is severe droughts have been accelerating. They're much more frequent. The consequence of that is that households don't have time to recover. Normally, there's a cycle of severe drought, loss of crops, loss of livestock, and then a period of time where...
You are the only participant in the conference. Please press any key on your keypad to remain in the conference.
Possible when you get hit with consecutive droughts, okay, and with some regularity. This slide that I just put up has to do with rainfall predictions. It's somewhat more mixed. Out of the 11 models, 7 of them show rainfall decreasing to the end of the century. All the way to the right-hand side, you can see the average is a 2.4% decline. So there's some sense that rainfall overall may be decreasing, but perhaps more of a problem is that the nature of the rainfall is changing. It's erratic. There's more intense rainfall. This is a chart that's based on actual daily weather data, which you don't see actually very often because it's hard to get daily met data. But
you are alone in the conference. You'll be disconnected.
to try to diffuse
Your call. You
neglected and virtually moribund at this time. So they revitalized them. Then they initiated among the communities some quite difficult intergroup dialogues on past grievances and attitudes. What happened to this group? Why did this act of violence take place? Why was there retaliation? What were the costs for the respective groups? And this was not an easy process. Then they also, however, they wanted people to get a better idea of what was actually happening, so that they could respond to the forces that were affecting them. So there was learning experiences. Whoops. I don't know why. Jumped. On climate change, climate adaptation, and conflict prevention. Then structures were created to begin to bring people into this process. So so-called women's peace networks were created. Youth groups were similarly created. So this was to give an organized mechanism to involve women and youth that didn't exist previously. The next step was then, once you had structured groups and more of dialogue going on, to identify some of the key and contested grazing areas and water points. Okay, so these are the natural resources that are most in contention, and to develop agreement among the communities about which ones were the most important and had the most potential for future conflict. And then they created work plans to address some of these problems in terms of landscape and climate trends. So basically work that they would do, intergroup work, groups that never interacted before, now actually working together for climate adaptation, water points, clearing bush. There's a problem with invasive species, and soil bunds. Soil bunds are these deep trenches that you build that collect water to hold it so that it doesn't all just run off. And then lastly, and extremely importantly, to actually institutionalize these kinds of arrangements and to develop community bylaws with local government on the joint use and management of natural resources. For the communities, so these three groups were the key collective actors within the project. The peace committees were important because that was the nexus that kind of fused traditional institutions and formal Ethiopian government institutions, okay? And as I said, they had been kind of defunct. They were revitalized. The second is the women's network. One of the things that's interesting, and from years past when I was there as well, is that women actually, even though now they're playing a very constructive role for promoting peace, they had been cheerleaders for conflict in the past, challenging the warriors of their group. Why don't you go out and fight these guys? What kind of a man are you? Maybe I should go marry a Borana. This kind of stuff. This really was a serious factor that added to sort of the conflict dynamics. That reversed through the creation of the Peace Network, the training on conflict prevention, management, and resolution, training on climate change. And the Women's Peace Network actually became sort of the main outreach mechanism to the different communities. And then lastly, to involve youth, young people 15 and up, in the past would have been involved in violent incidents. But this was interesting too because it helped to bring together different ethnicities around cultural issues. Okay, so that created another sort of bond that previously didn't exist. One group discussion we had, the young people were saying, previously before the project, if you brought us into a room together, it would never occur, a Boran to sit with a Guji. We would just sit in different places. So through this process, I mean, it's now, sort of an established practice among the young people. You always commingle when you sit and you have a meeting. What happened? Okay, so we want to look at these three areas: attitudinal, behavioral, and institutional change. The peace committees, which people said, well, in the old days, you probably should have called them war committees, because they basically promoted the interests of their individual communities. They began to adopt a focus on peace building and preventing conflict rather than advancing the individual community interests. And part of that, and very importantly, was that these dialogues and joint activities overcame one of the biggest obstacles, maybe the main obstacle to conflict prevention in the area, which is this so-called problem of ethnic attribution. Okay? And that simply means that if an act of violence takes place, if Kyle does something to me, then it's not just that Kyle has done something to me, it's those USAID guys that did it to me. Okay? And so I need building and do something in retaliation to the USAID group, rather than just seeing that Kyle get arrested or something like that. That was a dynamic that was central to the escalation of violence. Okay? Through all of these exercises, that began to be overcome. And in our interviews, really kind of across the board, people were at pains to say to us, if there's an act of violence, we recognize it as something that person did. And then it has to be responded to on that basis. As part of that, the peace committees, they intervene quickly now. They have better relations with the formal government authorities. They refer cases to them. These kind of different conceptions of justice have come better into balance. From a pastoralist point of view, if there's some violent action, killings, thefts, or something that take place, what is the response? Well, the response might be that the debt or transgression can be repaid through 100 cattle, okay, or something on that order. So that's sort of more restorative justice. The state thinks like a state in terms of punitive justice. Okay, if somebody commits a crime, that person is subject to formal prosecution and maybe goes to jail or whatever. So those changes, those sort of qualitative changes, have been accompanied by quantitative change, which is that killings and thefts have been reduced to extremely rare events within these project communities. In terms of actual climate adaptation activity, physical activities, there are lots of things that have been done. Thousands of hectares of rangeland have been improved through the bush clearing. There's lots of work to try to harvest and retain water through bunds and trenches. And then most importantly, very large-scale work actually on rehabilitating water ponds, which are essential for the pastoralists to bring their cattle and are points of conflict. You can imagine if you have deteriorating water sources that are shrinking, diverse ethnic groups, everybody wants to bring their cattle, it's sort of a ready-made recipe for conflict. Okay? The project became a resource for local government. Some of the studies that were done in relation to the project raised issues that were new to the local government authorities. It gave them an agenda of things to think about in relation to climate and conflict in their area. The peace centers themselves institutionally became seen as honest brokers. The implementers were from Haramaya University, which was a necessary step in Ethiopia because universities are part of the government. The government doesn't allow outside foreign-funded organizations to work on conflict issues in Ethiopia. So that's why Haramaya University was the implementer. And when problems arose, tensions over grazing areas, or especially during volatile election period, the local officials would turn to the peace centers as a resource. Can you convoke a dialogue? Can we bring people together and try to diffuse this situation? So in that sense, the peace centers became a resource. Of course, there were problems, and there were, you could not address all of the manifold problems of these communities. Some of the constraints have to do with governance in Ethiopia. There's an asymmetry in this relationship between customary or traditional institutions and formal institutions. The formal institutions of the state have more power. The peace committees, if your image of them was, sort of a group of elders within the community getting together and talking, that's not actually how they are. Okay? They have a very dominant participation of local government officials. Okay? So it's some mixture there. So government still has a heavy hand in these processes, but there's participation that did not exist before for the local communities. And while we're talking about this accomplishment of overcoming ethnic attribution and delinking violent acts from group identity, the government itself is still operating on this sort of ethnically based logic in many respects. So, for example, there's sort of a political process where new districts are created. Everybody wants their own district. Because if you get your own district, you get clientelism can reach you. There's a mechanism for that to happen. A lot of those districts are still constructed more or less on ethnic basis, even as communities are improving their conflict situation by getting away from that. Sometimes things happen where the tensions or the problems are actually caused by the state, not the communities themselves. So this was an example that we encountered. These guys in the picture are Kanso and Burji sharecroppers. They're cultivating on land which actually is wet season grazing area for Borana, traditionally. So they are seen there by local people as being there illicitly. These guys are just sharecroppers. Who are the landowners? Okay, so what was believed locally at the time there was the landowners are absentee, but they're approved by the government. So here's a conflict of a sort where really the catalyst behind it has to do with government policies. The communities by themselves can't necessarily sell that very easily. I won't go through all of this list. I'm sure most of you are familiar with lots of different climate adaptation strategies that rural communities in Africa are using these days. So pastoralists are diversifying their herd. Farmers are using hybrid seeds. Many people are trying to diversify their income. All of these are coping strategies, okay, to deal with climate and other pressures. But the problem is, our assessment was the climate change curve is ahead of the adaptive curve. A lot more can be done in terms of adaptation, but the climate problems are overwhelming lots of communities. And one of the main problems is this kind of weird combination of increasing heat, droughts, but more intense rain. It creates a situation where we have very parched land, heavy rain, the rain runs off, you don't get soil moisture, but soil moisture is what you need for good grazing land and for good crops. How would you measure that this climate change curve maybe is overwhelming the adaptation curve? Well, one indicator is the so-called problem of pastoralist dropouts. Okay?
You are the only participant in the conference. Please press any key on your keypad to remain in the conference.
Drought, loss of household assets. Some people just can't cut it anymore. Other people want to sell their remaining cattle, maybe move to town because they have doubts. They're wondering if pastoralism is a viable livelihood anymore. What happens when that takes place? Dropouts, they drift into town. They have sort of this improvisational sort of existence. They pick up catch-as-catch-can activities. They might hire out their labor, some petty trade, animal fattening, milk collection. So those are kinds of activities that they know at least something about because they're pastoralists. Some of them even do things like get involved in artisanal gold mining, but it's a very insecure, problematic kind of existence. Pastoralists, they don't have the educational skills.
You are alone in the conference.
Mostly young men and women, without good productive
Your call.
activities, which can be a source for future, albeit different, instability and conflict. Okay, so stepping back and looking at the project, we found 6 basic findings or lessons from what the project has accomplished. First, that it's possible to change conflict attitudes and behaviors in pastoralist communities in Africa, okay, and probably replicable. Second, climate change is a very powerful center of gravity to convoke different ethnic groups that were in conflict before. Why? Because it's a common external threat that everyone is facing. So it gives people an agenda to engage on, even if previously they did not communicate well. This process of joint adaptation activities is an important tool to reduce conflict. And it's not necessarily the physical changes that are brought about, say improving water ponds and so on, although that helps. But what people told us when we interviewed them was it was the experience of working with other groups in an intensive, joint kind of way that they'd never done before that built confidence and relationships that changed the dynamics, intergroup dynamics that had led to conflict in the past. So you're doing sort of these climate change adaptation activities, but in a way, it's this shared experience byproduct, which is essential to reducing the potential for conflict going forward. The last 2 lessons was the centrality of focusing on institutional relationships. So when we say institutional relationships, we're thinking about changes in structured attitudes and behaviors of people in different forms, and in the end to institutionalize it in an agreed upon set of bylaws. And then lastly, from our point of view, the peace centers are a positive return on investment because the costs of conflict in terms of the destruction, the loss of markets, the loss of access to education, the loss of access to medical services, over and above death and displacement directly caused by violence, is huge. It's huge. And these projects this project was not so much expensive as labor intensive. So it's a positive return in investment. The challenge going forward is to get the host government to appreciate that, such that these kinds of projects can be incorporated as budget lines because it makes sense by the host government rather than funded by external donors, especially in Ethiopia, where foreigners are not particularly welcome working on conflict issues to begin with. Okay, so this is the last slide I have. 3 propositions that are interlinked that go over and beyond this particular project, but go to this relationship between climate adaptation and conflict. So the first is that the collaborative activities to strengthen climate resilience focused on these institutional relationships. Okay, that's the central part of it. Can contribute to conflict prevention. As Kyle started out saying, kind of makes sense. If you have reduced conflict in an area, you have lots more opportunities to enhance the scope and quality of climate change adaptation, climate resilience measures. You have, you don't have security threats. You have more cooperative populations. It just ratchets up what can be done to a large degree. And then lastly, the relationship between those two things, it creates a virtuous circle, right? If increasing interethnic and interclan collaboration helps you do climate adaptation. Climate adaptation, it reduces some of the stresses that can lead to conflict, and so forth and so on. So this is a synergistic relationship. Okay, and the institutional piece of that is that it's not just a matter of like specific tasks, but changing patterns of behavior. So in other words, in responding to the climate challenge, and to be effective, you have to do it through certain kinds of institutional change. And it's that institutional change that is not just preventing conflict, but transforming the overall conflict dynamics of the region. So, as Kyle said, this is a pilot project. So pilot projects come to an end. So the question going forward is how can these relationships be sustained, and with whose support? So I will stop there. I'm happy to answer any questions.
So this mic does not amplify, but please speak so webinar people.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Kelly Witkowski from the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture. I was wondering over what time frame this project was implemented. What kind of training or facilitation did you provide to the university that was the local implementer and kind of support throughout the process? And then thirdly, did you analyze at all if the adaptation measures that you put into place benefited everybody in the community equally, or did you, in your vulnerability analysis, did you differentiate any particularly vulnerable subpopulations, or how did you go about doing that?
Okay. So, well, we were just doing the assessment, right? So we weren't implementing anything. The implementers were from Haramaya University, and they were kind of an interesting group. Basically the project director was a faculty member of the law school, but he had grown up as a pastoralist in Borona, and all of the other district leaders were also university educated people, but who had come from the region. So they had the local knowledge and they had the language skills and they had some of the relationships to make that work. The answer to your question about, sort of differentiated outcomes is not something that we focused closely on. I think, I think our impression was that maybe the results were stronger for women and youth and less so for the peace committees, because the peace committees were more embedded in the politics of the local situation. Does that get to what you, okay? Oh, I'm sorry, yeah. Time frame, 3 years. 3-year project. Okay. Anybody else? Yep.
When you looked at this project, was it built on experiences in other countries? Or can you talk about the experiences in other countries that might have similar approach?
Kyle, maybe you want to answer. I don't really know of previous projects that had this same approach. There were none.
This is Rose Schneider. I'm on the advisory committee for a conflict resolution and the reduction of terrorism in Zanzibar. And many of these things they're working with youth on, but they haven't yet added a climate change component. So I've been talking with them about that. So there might be in the fairly near future that incorporated in it. Just to let you know.
Yeah, and I think that that's what's for us, I think, intriguing in that because climate change is recognized by different groups with different perspectives. It comes as this external threat that everyone faces. It gives a somewhat different context for people to engage. And that might be a real advantage. It's not just that we need to address those issues. It might actually be an advantage to try to make use of those.
Hi, my name's Denise Ross. I'm with the Phase Zero project at New America. And I was curious about the role of data and transparency and mapping in helping to prioritize the sites for rehab. And also when you talked about the discussion about the landowner, the mysterious landowner, just wondering if there was a role for government transparency in helping to align efforts and advance the conversation within these groups.
Yeah, well, transparency is not the long suit in Ethiopia, unfortunately. So that's a challenge. I'm not sure exactly what you mean about the data transparency and how it might be used for the sites. I mean, the process was basically the different ethnic groups convening. They did mapping exercises to identify key grazing and water points, and then they had discussions about what the priorities would be for rehabilitation, which places through what process involving which people or communities, because different communities did different things. So I would say it was a social, local, political process more than it was a data-driven process. Any other questions? Yeah.
A question about your evaluation methods. I noted that one of the objectives of this project was to try to build up the group dynamics, and here in your conclusions you're kind of emphasizing the collaborative activities and the potential to help mitigate some of that instability that's being caused by these factors. So I'm wondering if you found a way to measure the group dynamics to try to see if they're just more oriented towards these specific climate adaptation activities or whether they're more sustained within the community and had other manifestations.
That's a really good question. The answer is we had limited time and resources, and we didn't get so far down the road in terms of looking at those group dynamics. But the project evaluation process itself probably has captured some of that. The project is just winding up or has just finished. And we had sort of a slightly unusual assessment because our assignment was not to evaluate the project per se, but to try to extract lessons learned from the project. So that's kind of the nature of the presentation. I probably should have made that clearer at the outset. Yeah.
One more question. Since young people and women seem to be the ones most interested and most open, what was the leadership of the group? Did they try to pull in young people and women as part of the leadership of the project?
That's another great question. One of our critiques in our report, and our report, if anybody's interested in the full-length report, is that... Next slide. Okay, great. Thanks, Haley. Yeah. Sorry, I lost what I was...
You are the only participant in the conference.
Yeah, what are the...
Please press any key on your keypad to remain in the conference.
What we had was the peace committees were still very heavily dominated by men. Women had almost no role. Forget about youth. And so we specifically recommended that be increased, that youth have to have some role on the peace committees. You know, I don't know to what extent that has been adopted, but I do know, because we talked to the project director even after we left, that the project director intended to try to increase women and youth participation in those community bylaws that I mentioned, so it actually would get codified so that it might take place.